Hello and welcome to episode 221 of the 21st Century Work-Life podcast. And this is a very special episode because it kicks off our new series of 7 episodes on connection and disconnection in remote teams. And what's even more special about it is that it's going to be brought to you by our friends at Shield GEO. So I'll tell you about them in a second. First off, let me remind you that this is a show about leading remote teams, online collaboration, and how distributed organizations are evolving. And the company behind this podcast, behind this show, is Virtual Not Distant, and I'm its director, Pilar Orti. Hello, if we haven't met before. Welcome. If you're a regular listener, welcome. I hope you stay with us for many more episodes. And Virtual Not Distant exists to help managers and their teams transition to an office optional approach. And you can find everything about us over at virtualnotdistant.com. Now, today's episode, this new series is going to be published in between our regular episodes. So the next episode of this series will appear in your podcast app in 2 weeks' time. So make sure you subscribe to the show. And the host for this series is Bree Caggiati. She is a journalist at Shield GEO, who are our partners for this series. And they are a distributed company that helps organizations employ people internationally. And they do this by looking after the tax, after the payroll, after all the things that can make employing people across the globe difficult. So they simplify the process of having an employee in a different country. And you might have heard, if you are a regular listener, one of their founders, Tim Burgess. He's been on this show talking about his experience of leading remote teams and building the organization on episodes 207 and 209. And indeed, he was the one that came up with the idea for this series. So he will tell you why in a minute in this episode. And listeners, all that remains for me to say is we'd love to hear from you if you have anything to add to the conversation, this emerging topic of connection and disconnection in remote teams. So do get in touch through virtualnotdistant.com. We have a contact form there, or email me directly, Pilar, Pilar, at virtualnotdistant.com. So that's it from me for now, because in this episode, Bree leads the discussion with her, Tim, Maya Middlemiss, and myself, talking about why we think it's the right time to dedicate a series of 7 episodes to connection and disconnection in remote teams. We hope you enjoy it.
Hello and welcome to our first episode of the mini-series Connection and Disconnection in Remote Teams. I'm your host, Bree Caggiati, and as Pilar mentioned, I'm a journalist for Shield GEO. I'll be hosting the next 7 episodes as we unpack this topic of connection and disconnection together. Today, for our first episode, I'm joined by the team from Virtual Not Distant, Pilar and Maya, as well as Shield's co-founder and director Tim Burgess. We discuss, roundtable style, some of the many intersecting subjects involved with connection in remote teams, and we share some of our own personal experiences of isolation and loneliness. Welcome everyone. I'm very excited to officially launch this conversation with you all and start to unpack some of the layers here. Should we start with you, Pilar? Would you like to share a little bit about how this collaboration came about and why you and Virtual Not Distant are interested in creating something around this topic?
On the 21st Century Work-Life podcast, where of course we talk about lots of stuff to do with virtual teams, we realized that we wanted to do more podcasting. But we also realized we didn't have the resources. So we thought, okay, why don't we say on the podcast that we're looking... We call them sponsors then, but maybe collaborators. We don't really know what we want. We just know we want to do more podcasting. And then Tim came up with something actually I hadn't even thought of.
Wow. Well, if it was my idea, then it was very well incepted by you, Pilar. Because we've been talking internally maybe about trying some different media. And then I was listening to 21st Century Work-Life podcast and I heard you put this call out and I thought, wow, well, what could be better than trying to do something with people who know the podcasting world so well and produce a podcast that we know and love. There's a lot of commonality, I think, in how we see the world of remote work in particular. And so, it's been a pretty smooth process so far, I think.
this topic, and I think it was something that was very much being explored within Shield GEO we were calling it loneliness then. And there was something really, in 2019, it was really starting to emerge, the theme of loneliness in remote teams. We've already got over it's fantastic. And now we're in okay, what are the dangers of this? So I think that's then how it started to evolve.
Yeah. I think, actually, we did a project. I don't know if I ever really mentioned this, but we did a project with some students from Sydney University. They've got a group called Business One, which is undergraduate students who want to do a collaborative project with businesses. And this was organized by Suja, our product marketing manager. And what we asked them to do was find out or have a look at the remote work community and where we might be able to be helpful to that community in this emerging environment. There are a lot of areas which are well covered, and then there are some areas which aren't as well covered. And so they took a look at that to see. Basically, they were looking at where are people asking questions online in various mediums that aren't really getting answered. And one of the topics that they came across was the idea of sort of loneliness and the disconnection of being separated from your colleagues. I think actually, Maya, it was you who pushed it more in the direction of connectedness overall as opposed to just loneliness.
Well, I think there are lots of different threads to this, and it will be very interesting to see where this conversation goes throughout the season. I think the whole idea of mental well-being and emotional well-being is something that's coming into the public conversation more and more, whether in relationships or in the workplace particularly. And we can't afford, as advocates for remote work, as a generally good thing. It would be very naive to overlook some of the potential downsides and not to recognize that connectedness and disconnectedness are two sides of the same coin.
Yeah, absolutely. It's something Bree and I talked about actually just the other day, something we're always conscious of as an employer. When you're hiring someone remotely, actually, you are putting them in a situation where they're disconnected or where there are barriers to connection, let's say. And so I think that's one of the threads certainly that we'll explore through the season is there responsibility associated with that? And if so, what is that sort of responsibility? As you say, Maya, it does tie into these overall themes of, you can look at it from a productivity point of view, but also just from a general human well-being point of view. Are people having a good experience and working in a way that's going to be sustainable for them in the long term?
I think we have a responsibility to try and facilitate that conversation a bit as well, because a lot of employers, a lot of managers do find it quite daunting to talk about issues of how people are managing emotionally in their work. They can measure certain aspects of productivity, but whether people truly feel connected, it will show in their productivity eventually, but long before that, there might be much more that can be done, which is why I think it's really important that we air it and talk about it. It doesn't have to become a problem, but it certainly will be if it's ignored.
I think that's definitely one of the motivators, is just to bring this into conversation. And that's kind of why we want to do 6 or 7 episodes and to really delve into it, is to give it really space to produce conversations and discussion outside of the podcast as well, not only with the guests that we're speaking with, but hopefully with listeners and their teams.
Yeah, and I think because it's such a complicated issue, when we talk about the reason why we wanted to do a season, was once we started to unpack it a little bit internally, there was some really meaty topics in there. Like just that idea of duty of care. What's the employer's responsibility and what's the manager's responsibility? What's the individual's responsibility? Just looking at that from a few different angles that's quite a meaty topic. And then the second aspect, and this is one of the things that I love the most about the remote community, and I hope it stays this way forever, is that there are so many passionate advocates within the community who are willing to share their experiences and who are open to looking at things from different viewpoints, which makes for great conversations. And so we're very excited about some of the guests that we have and how they're going to add, I think, to the conversation.
From lots of different angles as well. So we're speaking with a psychologist, we're speaking to app developers, speaking to researchers, we're speaking to advocates, as you mentioned. And so I think we're going to get a lot of different perspectives on this as well. It's not just going to be from one side or from one space in the remote work
Well, one of the reasons why I was delighted that you suggested this topic is that it's something that Maya and I have talked about a lot. We haven't talked about it huge amounts in the podcast. We did have one episode dedicated to disconnection, but it's something we've always wanted to raise the profile of and for it to feature a lot more. It's just we haven't been able to fit it in. So I'm really delighted that someone else has actually said, we'd really like to do it, and then we've had to make the space. Because as we all know, when someone else comes in, then you make the space.
Yeah,
The other thing is that disconnection is not something that I struggle with a lot personally. Because of the way I am, because of the way I run my life, because of where I live, because of the networks I have, I can't connect, funnily enough, a lot of the time with that sense myself. So I think it's really great to be bringing different voices and different experiences. And of course, we haven't mentioned, Bree, that where are you based?
Yeah, so I'm based in Calgary in Canada. I've just moved here about 5 months ago from Brisbane, Australia. So I'm the only team member from Shield who's currently living in Canada. So I'm pretty physically isolated from the rest of my team, and certainly the only one in my specific team of marketing. All the rest of them are in Australia. So yeah, this is definitely speaking to me and this time in my life and the season that I'm experiencing. So I'm really excited to have these discussions and learn a lot as this goes on, because I'm definitely experiencing this as it sort of unfolds. I'm in a process of sort of trial and error around some of the things that we've been discussing around connection and how to connect with the team that is isolated physically, isolated time zone wise. So one of the things that I've done while I've been living here is move into a co-working space, which is something that I wasn't using at all when I lived in Brisbane. Or I was maybe once a fortnight or a couple of times a fortnight just for something different, but it definitely wasn't related to feeling isolated. Whereas now I think it's one of the things that I've decided that I need to do, as well as some of the tactics and opportunities that I have within the team. From my own perspective, this is really timely, and I'm already reaping a lot of benefit from the research.
That's funny, actually. I didn't realize how this ties into your personal arc, Bree.
Definitely.
If we were cleverer, we would have organized it this way, that we sent you to the other side of the world to be by yourself.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly.
It is interesting, Pilar, the point you raised about people's personal experience. It struck me when we did a little type form that we sent out. One of them was to the virtual Team Talk Slack group, and I think it was Nupur who said, like, this form, it assumes that you've experienced loneliness. Like, it was the first question, how have you experienced loneliness at work? And she's like, I've never had that, so I just couldn't proceed with the form. And then we were talking about that internally. We were like, I can't imagine somebody who hasn't experienced that. And so it's interesting that it's such a polarizing issue.
It is. We are such a self-selecting group. The kind of people who advocate about remote work, who do podcasts about remote work, we're obviously people who've chosen to put ourselves in this situation where we're not in a big, busy, co-located workspace. So I do think we probably end up within that community, within that bubble, with something that's perhaps not typical. And that's why it's coming to the fore now that remote work is becoming more and more mainstream, that it's actually absorbing people who maybe didn't consciously make that choice or didn't make it in such an examined way or an intentional way, and maybe are finding that these consequences are happening because all their remote colleagues have been doing it for years, are people who were very well adjusted to it, and it hasn't occurred to them that it might be a problem. So maybe that's why we're starting to talk about it more now.
Yeah, that's certainly something that we've experienced. Working remotely is something that is not necessarily their number one choice. Right. I think for a lot of people, if you said to them, hey, you can work for this organization and the office is going to be literally next door to your house with all of your colleagues, they're going to be right next door. You've got a 20-second commute. For a lot of people, I think that would be the ideal, or some sort of variation of that. But because of their personal circumstances, because of their carer responsibilities, because of where they're living or the commuting or hundreds of other factors, that remote work is more attractive to them than the alternative because of the balance or the or what it allows them to do within their broader life.
Yeah, and I think the very fact that remote work exists is therefore creating an opportunity for those people to be economically active. And a generation ago, or a decade ago, there probably would have been very little choice. Then you might have to give up your work to be a carer, and as such, it's more difficult for people to say if there are things they're not completely comfortable about with that setup, if they're still feeling privileged that they can work remotely, that they can still have a meaningful career and progression and so on, then it's quite hard to say, well, actually, I'm really lonely, or I really need support in these softer non-management issues, perhaps, to just make it through the day okay.
I think also this working away from each other and working away from people with whom we'd normally have some sort of connection because we were sharing the physical space is quite new. I mean, there's always been virtual teams, but in this way and with all this mass, with all the people that are doing it now and in the way we're doing it now, it's very new. And thinking about what it's about, I think lots of stuff starts to play in, like trust. When we look at trust, if we don't feel trusted, we feel disconnected. That might lead to loneliness, regardless of where we are. And I think that the more, as you were saying earlier, the more we unpick this and see, actually, maybe it's not for some people. Maybe it's not as much as having other bodies around us as being trusted to do something. And that helps us feel connected and therefore gives us that energy and we don't feel isolated anymore. And if we look at what we do at Virtual Not Distant, I was thinking of this today with the whole visible teamwork aspect. All those practices are about connection. Of course, they're about getting the work done, but they are about connection. And I'm really, even this conversational really, it's got so many layers, this connection and disconnection, and so many places to attack it in. That it's huge. It needs a whole series. Maybe you can do a spin-off podcast.
We'll just make the season last forever. I think it's also worth very clearly pointing out that people can be very disconnected in co-located workspaces as well. And there are lots of people who are very unhappy and lonely and feel a lack of trust, a lack of motivation, and a lack of shared purpose with people they sit right next to all day, every day. And that might be even worse.
Yeah,
Definitely.
It was fascinating. Actually, there was an article I read. It was from a couple of years ago in The Guardian about loneliness at work, and it didn't mention remote work at all. It talked about all of these people who felt intense disconnection, who were so demotivated, and they were all working in co-located spaces. But maybe their team wasn't with them, or maybe they were, maybe they spent periods working by themselves within that space, but they had colleagues around. They just weren't connected to them. And so I think it could, we'll see how we go, but I think this could be yet another of the ways that you can look at remote work as exploring topics which are actually very helpful to the broader world of work, which can be applied in a pure co-located, totally synchronous, everybody in an open plan office space. You can still apply some of those concepts because there's humans involved in every one of those stages.
Yeah, that's so definitely interesting. Remote work is almost like a crucible, a testing ground for some of these bigger issues in the workplace. Things get thrown into the spotlight in remote because we haven't got those kind of obvious shared spaces to fall back on and rub along in. And it's just made me remember actually listening to Bree's experience of relocating. I had a similar experience a decade ago now, goodness me, actually it's 11 years of moving to another country and taking my remote work with me. And actually looking back on that, I remember thinking at the time, the work is the only thing that stayed the same. And that was the only thing where I truly felt connected when I was trying to, it was completely my choice to do so, but it didn't make it any less hard to be finding networks and friends and connections within a new community and within a second language. And actually the only thing that was consistent in my life at all at the time was the work. So even though all those people were now in another country, I actually felt much more connected to them than I did anybody in my new community for a fairly long time.
Wow.
I think I've heard the same thing from even many of our colleagues at Shield, is that at some points in their life, they're more connected with their team who live in a different continent than with their friends and family who live in the same city, because we have those intentional things set up to be able to connect, whereas sometimes the other relationships sort of fall by the wayside because you kind of expect that to just keep going on. Whereas when you're remote, you have to make that intentional effort towards connection. And if those systems are already there, then sometimes that's easier just to follow in the system rather than be intentional in some way that you haven't traditionally had to be before. And I think it definitely speaks to a lot of the experiences of disconnection feeling compounding. So it's not necessarily easy to depict where it's coming from. Am I feeling disconnected because I'm a remote worker, or am I feeling disconnected because I haven't seen my family in a month? Or am I feeling disconnected because I don't have hobbies outside of work? What's the catalyst? What's causing these feelings? And often it's a combination of all of them creating the overwhelming sense. But I guess we're speaking from remote work because that's where we're sitting, and that there hasn't been a lot of research in this area that thus far. And so we're really excited to be able to contribute to that space. But it's also, I think, as Tim said, an opportunity to speak to the wider society and what we're experiencing as a community, as a place, as a time in history, and sort of where we're moving forward as well.
Yeah, I think it's a great point. I was going to say, you've raised like 5 great points in a row there. But one of the things certainly that I've been thinking about over the second sort of half of last year was the idea that work itself is something of a practice ground. Because, as you pointed out, your life outside of work can sometimes be much more complicated. Work, in a lot of respects, is the same every day. For a lot of people, it starts the same time. The same people are there. You're doing similar things. The projects that you do sort of repeat. Most people don't go to work one day as a marketer and the next day they're an accountant and the day after that they're a doctor. Or whatever. You're doing the same job every day for the most part. And that means that there are great opportunities to practice and learn and develop in a controlled environment. If I'm trying to get better at being on time and I wanted to do that in my personal life, then, I have to look at something like, let's say whenever I'm going out to dinner, which might happen once a week or once every couple of weeks. And there's all these other variables. It can be a different place, meeting up with different people. So for me to be on time is actually a little complicated. But if I want to practice being on time for meetings, I've got like 3 of those a day. So it's very accessible to be able to practice that. When we look at the idea of how people are feeling and the opportunities that they might have to experiment with how they're feeling or try and moderate how they're feeling, there are a lot of opportunities to do that in the 7 or 8 hours that you spend working each day. And in fact, quite a lot of tangible ways that you can play with that you might not have as easily accessible in your personal life. One of the things that we often hear with remote work and loneliness is, I just got to go out and play sport, or go out and join a club, join some sort of hobby. And that's a solution that might work for some people in some circumstances, but it's not some magic fix that automatically is going to work for everybody.
There is a wider implication, and one of the reasons why I think we're talking about connection, disconnection, loneliness now is that we're talking about that in society, at least in Western society, quite a lot, definitely in the UK. And as we were talking, I was thinking also technology is being blamed for a lot of that disconnection. And I'm really excited to show how technology can be used to help with connection. Because it's always so easy. And I think that technology has enabled me to feel more connected.
It's easier in the shared space where work provides that structure for you. This is the time that we go for lunch, or this is when we have a meeting and we'll move to this bit of the building or whatever. Whereas in remote work, there's more of a sense of having to foster your own resilience and your mindset and skills for organizing your time and for organizing, just whether you've got an ergonomic workstation so you're not going to cripple your back, or making sure that you get enough exercise or that you eat healthily and things like that, which workspaces might some workspaces want to give people 3 meals a day so that they'll keep them in one place, like on the Google campus and so on, and really supervise their whole life. Whereas remote work is the absolute opposite of that. It's about people really having to take responsibility for how they organize their time, how they get their connections set up so that they can log in and do their work, and all sorts of little bits like that fall back on the individual. And to a certain extent, connectedness and being responsible for your own emotional health, knowing what you need socially. Well, actually, I haven't moved out of this chair for 8 hours. I'm going for a walk and I need to get away from this. I'm actually going to cancel my next meeting because otherwise I've reached the point where I'm not being healthy or well. And that's going to affect both my performance and also how I might be longer term. So people don't have to make those decisions by and large in a very structured, co-located workspace. And maybe those are the skills that we don't recruit for or train people in when we're putting them in that transition.
Well, something we talked about, Bree and I talked about the other day, was that often there's like a honeymoon period with remote work, and you know, particularly people who are shifting to it. And, you know, for like the first couple of months, you're so happy to not be commuting. You know, that you could almost anything could happen, and you'd be like, well, as long as I don't have to get in that car and deal with the traffic, you know, I don't mind anything else that happens. And so it can be something that I think creeps up at you. And there's not, like, as far as I know, you know, you can get like a Fitbit or something that'll tell you, hey, you haven't moved around that much today. You should, you know, you can outsource some of that management onto a technology solution. But I don't know if there's a solution yet that's like, you haven't smiled today, or you haven't, you know, shared any personal information with someone today, or you haven't really connected with anybody today, and that can help remind you to do that. So certainly, I think one of the dangers with connection is that it's something that, you know, it's a boiling frog analogy. It's something that can creep up with you over time, you know, and then that can compound over time into this feeling of being set adrift.
It's interesting that you said that you can't necessarily outsource that connection, because that is what our body is doing when we're feeling lonely, is telling us that we need to go out and connect. That's the biological response, is we should be going out to connect. So we don't necessarily need to outsource it. We just need to know what to do with it when we feel it, and to know what the next step is. It's not necessarily like fundamentally a bad thing to feel lonely. It's just telling you something about yourself and the environment that you're in and what you should do next.
We have to hear those messages, though. I think all too often we're accustomed to suppress them or ignore them. We're like, you know, I can't go out for a walk now. It's the middle of the afternoon. I have to sit here and tear my hair out and cry instead, because that's what I'm being paid to show up for. But it's about tuning in to those messages that we do have them. But yes, I think a lot of us have forgotten how to hear.
Exactly. Our body knows how to take care of ourselves. We just need to listen and respond.
Wow, that's fascinating. I must admit, when it's manifested, the way that it's manifested for me, when I've felt lonely, certainly, and it's happened a couple of times, I felt far less equipped to be able to do anything about it than I would normally.
Yeah, that is unfortunately the downside of it. It's sort of a loop in on itself. When you're feeling lonely, you're kind of telling yourself those lies of no one wants to be around me right now, or even just you're feeling low. So it's the barriers are higher to leave your house or to reach out to a friend at that point. So I think it's about listening to yourself at that point, but also having sort of strategies that you can fall back on that don't take as much effort. So on your own, when you're feeling lonely, making that effort to call up a friend and say, hey, can we hang out is maybe too much. But maybe it's not too much to go on a walk by yourself, or maybe it's not too much to send a text, or maybe it's not too much to read a book. And knowing yourself and going through that self-awareness or those times of reflection to realize at this point, this is something that I can do. And following through on that, and not doing the thing that you think you should do or that somebody has told you is helpful when you're feeling lonely, but listening to yourself and what is within reach for you at that point of time.
And from the point of view of this conversation and the fact that this conversation is starting to emerge, as organizations, as managers, as teams, we can't wait for the crisis to happen to talk about this. We can't wait for the crisis to happen to have those systems that help us to feel connected. And that is really hard because we haven't even talked about that this is going to be a problem. The problems with going remote, especially when you're transitioning, are people going to do the work? No one is saying, oh, well, one of the problems might be, and people do talk, actually, I'm being unfair because people do talk about the fact they're not going to feel like a team anymore. But that is never a priority when we're transitioning. There's always something else. And then when we start saying, you know what, I feel disconnected, I'm not happy, that's when we start to put systems in place. So that's a really nice point, Bree.
I think there's an acknowledgement that there's going to be a loss of sort of immediacy and this great interaction, but not necessarily what that might mean for them individually. Because I think that disconnection is something that is experienced very much individually. And that's, I think one of the most difficult parts is, particularly if you think about someone who transitions from co-located to remote, they may not have experienced this before. And you may not necessarily anticipate that it's going to happen. In which case, being ready to recognize what changes might be going on within yourself is asking a lot, because there might be things that are very unfamiliar to you. So, for example, for myself, I can think of two big occasions when I was working remotely and I felt disconnected, and so I know it's a thing for me, and so I'm quite now. I'm actually afraid of working from home. I only do it in certain circumstances. And so I'm very cautious about it because for me, it's something that I'm very conscious of. But before I had those experiences, I thought I could work on the moon and be totally fine.
And I wonder how often, if we're hiring, if we're recruiting, we might interview someone and say, who's never worked remotely before, how can we expect them to be able to know actually whether it's going to work for them or not? And I know that I've had lots of experience hiring people for remote roles, and there have been times when it hasn't worked out and there's been absolutely nothing in the recruitment phase that could have been done differently. They simply had never had to experience that amount of emotional self-reliance, and they were very, very clear about the reasons they thought they would love it, and actually couldn't hack it. And it didn't end well. And at least now there are far more options, and remote work doesn't mean, a decade ago, remote work basically meant home working. Whereas now there are so many alternatives, and we can explore all of those and work out what's going to be the best fit for the individual, or recognize that it can be something fluid. Like Bree is finding going to a co-working now is something that she's attracted to, whereas that would have been an occasional thing before. And very occasionally I go out to a coffee shop, whereas I'm much happier working at home most of the time. And if you have that recognition that just tuning into your own moods, it's like what we were saying about tuning into what your body or your mind is trying to tell you, that actually I need to see other humans today. So that means I probably need to get dressed and leave the house. Otherwise it's not going to happen. And being able to act on that, having the flexibility in your life and your work that you can do that is brilliant. A lot of people don't have that degree of autonomy, and perhaps we should celebrate it more and explore the ways that we can get variety into our working environment and our day.
Yeah, definitely. For sure.
I think it's a fascinating point that you raised there, Maya, about the recruitment, in that I think it's, like you say, it's impossible to sort of tell, and also because there's so many factors involved that everyone will bring their own biases in. One thing I always think about is I'm less worried about people who are in a relationship with children, for example, than I am about people who who aren't in a relationship. I'm less worried about people who are living in a flat share than I am about people who are living by themselves. And they're all my biases, right? Because in my mind, when I've lived by myself, I'm more susceptible to loneliness than when I had flatmates. And now that I've got kids and a spouse, there are people around all the time. But you can't hire based on those characteristics. And also, that's just my interpretation. It doesn't mean that it's the same for anybody else. I'm sure that you could have a situation where you were living in a shared accommodation with children and a spouse and still feel lonely.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah.
So I don't think there's any sort of magic filter that we can put in place to say that, this person isn't going to experience this at some point in their life. And probably the best example would be, that all of those personal circumstances can change.
Which I think is why what Maya was saying is so important. It's about trial and error and giving ourselves the space and flexibility to change. What might work for one season isn't going to work for another. And we don't have to be hard on ourselves for changing, and we don't have to be hard on our teammates for changing either. It's just about adapting and giving each other the flexibility and the autonomy to try those new methods to see what might work in this new set of circumstances.
Maybe we need to review it more consciously, because I know that Pilar and I have just been working on an episode about onboarding and processes for integrating new team members. And I'm wondering how many of us, when we're onboarding new remote colleagues, really build that in to see how they're doing on just the kind of day-to-day work environment front. If it's their first time in a remote role, we might be very concerned with how they're connecting with key people that they're going to be working with and how they're integrating into the work. But to say, how about your day? How's that going? How is it getting up and getting started in the morning? Do you get any exercise? Are you eating okay? I mean, not you're going to turn into their mum and start trying to micromanage their life. But there might have been things that the structure of their day, if it's their first remote role, it might have changed beyond recognition in ways that they hadn't anticipated or had unintended consequences. And it's not necessarily that the manager has a responsibility to make all that right, but maybe just to bring it up occasionally or explore what's changed and how that might be affecting them.
Yeah, definitely. I think it's way easier to respond to a question than to bring it up yourself.
Particularly early on in your employment. It's a pretty brave person that would start that and say, look, I'm in week 2. I'm freaking out over here because I'm on probation and I feel disconnected and unproductive. But it's a very interesting point, Maya, that when is the right time to start that? Because one of the things I notice around onboarding is any cautionary messages that we tell people when they're in this hyper excited, super motivated phase tend to just whistle straight past them. And so one of the things that we've done with our onboarding, for example, is we train really slowly, because we used to find that we would say to people, here's this information. It's a lot to go through. We want you to go through something. They're like, oh, I've read it. I'm fine. And we're like, I don't know, it seems a little quick. Are you sure? And they're like, yeah, no, I'm good, because they're so excited. That's wonderful. That's what you want. You want them to be excited to join and to start work. But then we try to slow it down. And the example I give, it doesn't always play out like this, but basically I want people to say, look, enough. I get it. Can you stop going on about this thing now? Because if they have that level of real understanding, which might express as frustration, then we don't worry about them remembering that information in 3 months or 6 months or in a year. And so I wonder as well, when we talk about things like work habits or how they're working out, that when is the best time to start that conversation? Or maybe it is a good conversation to start early, but knowing that you're going to have regular touch points on it, because maybe they're going to feel safer, Bree, as you pointed out, to talk about it further down the track, or maybe the honeymoon is going to wear off and some cracks are going to start to emerge.
It's probably very important to plant those seeds, just as the whole onboarding process is about integrating into your culture and communicating what you want them to learn about you and how you do things and how the conversations that you can have, even if they might not feel comfortable responding very openly in that very early phase when they're trying to impress you and really get settled into the work and show you that you've done a great job in hiring them. They might not be able to say, well, actually, I'm very concerned about this. But the fact that you've asked it, the fact that you've put it out there, will hopefully make it easier further down the line, and hopefully before things reach a crisis point, that they might remember that there is a little bit of a culture of openness about this that they can fall back on.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more.
Yeah, definitely. Okay. Should we sort of wind this down, or is there anything that we want to cover that we haven't covered yet?
If anyone is listening into this and has any thoughts that they want to share, we haven't mapped it all out in advance. It's a topic that we're exploring as we go. And so we'd love to hear from any listeners about your own experiences, whether you agree or disagree, or whether however this topic might strike you. We're really keen to engage with people and find out what else is going on and hear from as many different viewpoints as we can.
We'll provide lots of ways in the show notes where people can message us either publicly and join a conversation about it more openly, or people might have things they want to feed back more privately or even anonymously on this subject. We'd very much respect that anonymity. If you want to join the conversation on that basis, we can feed it into future conversations on a very abstract level, but it'd be very valuable insight. We'll be talking about it in our usual social networks.
Yeah, great. Thank you, everyone. This has been great. And thanks so much for helping me introduce this topic and this little mini series. And also thank you for all the background work that all of you have done so far and will continue to do over the course of the series as well. I really appreciate your help as we sort of launch our first podcast. So thank you so much for that. And thank you everyone for listening. Thank you so much to everyone who's listened to this first episode. We hope you enjoyed it. We look forward to having you along for the remainder of the series, and we'd love to hear any feedback you may have throughout. We'll be back in 2 weeks. Talk soon.
Listeners, thank you very much for listening to that first episode of our series on connection and disconnection in remote teams. As Tim said, we would be delighted to hear from you. You can send us a long-form message over at virtualnotdistant.com, or you can email me directly and I will make sure that everyone in the team gets your reply, Pilar, Pilar, at virtualnotdistant.com. You can also, of course, find out more about Shield GEO. That's shieldgeo.com. Wherever you are, whatever you're doing, enjoy.